What's going on, guys? So in this video, we're going to do 5 separate projects, all HTML, CSS, and JavaScript, and these are actually pulled from my 50 projects in 50 days course on Udemy. So if you're interested in the entire course and all 50 projects, I'll have a link in the description with a promo code for just $9.99. All right, so just to kind of show you what we'll be doing in this video, the first project is going to be a scroll animation, which is pretty common. You see this a lot in websites where you have some content, and then as you scroll down, you have other elements come in from the left or right or fade in or whatever, and then as we scroll up, they'll go away. All right, so that's the first project. Second one is going to be this rotating navigation where we have a hamburger menu. If I click that, basically the whole site just tilts and rotates and exposes the menu here. And then we can, close it back up. And then we'll be doing this form input wave animation. So if I click in an input box, the label has this cool animation, moves up, and if I click outside of it, then it goes back to normal. Then we have the 3D boxes background project where we'll have these separate boxes and click this button and it just gets put together into a single image. All right, so that's that. Then we have the hoverboard project, which will have all these squares, and as soon as we come in here with our mouse, we get these random colors, different colors, and as we move out of the boxes, they fade away and it gives us this cool little effect. All right, so those are the 5 projects we'll be doing in this video. And the point of all these projects is to improve your CSS skills as well as your JavaScript and being able to work with the DOM, manipulate the document object model. All right, and if you're interested in the 45 other projects, I'll have a link in the description to the full course. All right, so let's get started. All right, so in this project, we're going to build a scroll animation, which is pretty simple. We can most likely do this all in one video. However, it's very useful. You might see these websites where you start scrolling and parts of the site, images or sections of the website start to come in. So I just created these content blocks, and you can see there's 3 to begin with. But if I go and I start to scroll down, the next one comes in from the left. Go down some more, next one comes in from the right, and it's going to alternate where it comes in from. So we're going to use CSS transitions to have it come in smoothly. We're going to use JavaScript to basically tell where the trigger point is for the next box to come in. And then we're going to add a specific class to show it. And then if I go back up, it'll remove the class when it hits the trigger point, and it'll all, slide back out. All right, so I think it's really useful. You can use this in a lot of different UIs and different websites. So that's it. Let's get into it. Okay, so this is a very useful but simple project, so we can probably get this done in one video. So let's jump into our project starter here, and for the title, I'm going to just call this scroll animation. And we're going to go down here into the body, and all we really need is a bunch of boxes, which would ultimately contain your website content. We're not going to waste time creating content. We're just going to have a bunch of boxes and then apply the animation to them. I am just going to put an H1 here and say scroll to see the animation. And then under that, we'll have a class of box. And I'm just going to put an H2 with the word content. We'll just copy this down. We'll have a bunch of these. Okay. Now, ultimately, like I said, you would have, these would be cards or just sections of your website, whatever it is that you want to bring in with that slide in animation. So let's go into our style sheet here, and I'm going to add a background color. And let's make that hexadecimal EFEDD6. So kind of a tannish background. And then let's see, display flex, justify direction. Okay, so that's good. I'm going to get rid of the height and the overflow hidden because we do want a scroll bar, obviously. This is a scrolling animation. And then for the H1, I'm going to just set margin to 10 pixels, and then let's create the style for the boxes. So I'm going to use a background color of steel blue. Let's make the text color white. and I'm going to display flex because I just want to align the H2 that's inside to the center, both horizontally and vertically. So display flex, align items, center, and justify content, center. And let's set a width of 400 pixels on the box, and let's do a height of 200 pixels. Okay, we want to separate them out, so let's do a margin of 10 pixels, and let's do a border radius. So border radius will do 10 pixels, and let's add a little box shadow. Obviously this stuff isn't needed, but I just want to make it look decent. So we'll do 2 pixels and 4 pixels for the offsets, 5 pixels for the blur, RGBA for the color, which is going to be 000, 0.3 for the alpha value. And then for the animation, we're going to use the transform property with translate X, because that's what we want to do, is move these along the X axis. So initially, let's set box, the class of box, transform, and we want to set the translate Y. Translate X, which is horizontal. It's the X axis. Oops, I forgot my semicolon up here. And I'm gonna set this to 2. So 0 is the default. If I set it to 0, there's no change. If I set it to, let's say, 100 pixels and save, you can see it gets moved over 100 pixels, gets moved over to the right. So what I'm going to do is set this to 200%, which is going to move it way off the screen to the right. And then what's going to happen is if we have the class of show, so let's say box with the class of show, then we're going to set the transform and translate translate X to 0, which is the default. So if I go over here and I apply a class of show to this first one, it's going to show because it's in its regular position. The rest of them are still 200% over here. And then what we'll do is we'll have a transition so that when that class gets added, it transitions in smoothly from over here. All right, so we want to add a transition on the transform property. We'll do a 0.4 second duration with an ease effect. Okay, now the way it is now, if we add the JavaScript and we add the scroll functionality and they come in, they're all going to come in from this side. I actually want every other one to come in from different sides. So what we can do is right here, let's take our box class and let's use nth of type, which is a pseudo selector, and we can select all of the even elements, all the even boxes. Okay, so basically, every other one. And what we'll do is instead of setting the initial transform translate X to 200%, we're going to set it to negative 200%, which is going to put them over here. So all the even ones are now over here, all the odd ones are on this side. Okay, and then when we have them come in, when we dynamically add the class of show, they're going to come in from different sides. All right, and we have to also figure out when we want them to come in as we scroll. So that should do it for the CSS. Actually, I just want to make the H2 a little bigger. So let's say box H2. Set the font size to 45 pixels. And then we'll jump into our JavaScript. And first thing we want to do is bring in our boxes. So let's say const boxes and document.query. We want query selector all because there's more than one. So this will put it into an array or a node list. And then we want to fire off an event when we scroll. So on the window, we're going to add an event listener of scroll. And when that happens, we'll have a function called check boxes, because we want to check the positioning of each box. And a box could be anything. It could be any section of your website or an image or whatever. So we're going to have this function check boxes, and we need to figure out where is the trigger point. Where do we want, when we're scrolling down, where do we want them to start to come in? So we're going to be using window.innerHeight. In fact, we can just console log that so you can see, and we're going to run checkboxes to begin with anyways right here. So we'll go ahead and run that, and then if I open this up, you'll see 888 is the window height, not counting the console. If I move this console up and I reload, now the height is 406. So we're getting the inner height, and we want the trigger point, so basically where we want, you know, it's a scroll in, we're going to want that to be a little less than the inner height. And we can't just use a fixed number because the height could be, you know, different at any point. So what we're going to do is divide this by 5 and then multiply it by 4. So now let me just reload this. So you can see the height here is 666. If I save that now, this gives us, this equation here gives us 532. All right, so that's going to be our trigger point. So I'm actually going to put this into a variable. We'll call it trigger bottom. So where in the window do we want it to trigger? So we have that. Now let's go ahead and take our boxes, which we brought in, which is a node list that we can loop through. And we'll say for each box, for each box, let's get the top of the box. And when I say box, you know, I mean the elements here. So const box top. I'm going to set this to the whatever box we're dealing with, because remember we're looping through them, and there's this method called get bounding client rect. So I actually have this. I want to show you this real quick, just so you understand what this does. So this method returns what's called a DOM rect object, and DOM rect, it's just basically a rectangle, describes the size and position of a rectangle. So it returns that, providing information about the size of an element and its position relative to the viewport. So where in the viewport is it? And there's a bunch of properties that we can use on this. If we go down here, we have the X, Y, width, height, where it is, where the top of it is, where the right, where the bottom, where the left of it is. So we want to see where the top of that particular box is. So we're going to add here dot top. Okay, so that will give us the top value. And then all we need to do after that is see if the top of the box is less than the trigger bottom. If it is, we want to add the class of show. If it's not, if it's more, then we want to remove the class of show. So let's say if the box top is less than the trigger bottom, then let's take that box and let's add a class. So classlist.add of show. Else, then we want to remove it. So box.classlist.remove show. Okay, so now I'm going to go and just remove this show that we added manually. Now notice that it's only showing the first 3 because those are in range. Now when we start to scroll, it's going to fire off an event, and the reason we see these come in initially is because of this right here. If we don't have that, we're not going to see them because this hasn't fired off yet. If I scroll, it does. I mean, if you want that functionality where it doesn't show it until you scroll, that's fine, but usually you would show everything above the fold. So we run that initially first. Then we start to scroll, and as soon as this is true, as soon as the top of the next box is less than the trigger bottom point, which is a little less than the entire height of the viewport, it's going to come in because it adds that class of show. And what that class of show does is sets it to its normal position. Now if it's even, it starts over here, so it comes in from that way. If it's not even, it starts over here and comes in from that way. So every other one comes in from a different direction. And as we scroll up, it's still going to fire off this event, and it's still going to check this. So if this is not true, it'll remove the class. So as we scroll up, you'll see that they'll start to go out. Now, one thing I just noticed is I do have a horizontal scroll bar here, and I don't want that. So in my CSS, I'll just add on to the body here, and I'll say overflow X, because this is the X-axis scroll bar. We're going to set that to hidden, so that will get rid of that horizontal scroll bar. All right, so pretty easy, and I mean, a lot of people use jQuery for something like this, or a library like Animate on Scroll. Animate on Scroll is actually a really cool library, and if you want to do some funky stuff, then you can use that. But I mean, if it's just something simple and you're just bringing in elements when you scroll down, this is very lightweight, you know, no extra libraries or anything, and it's really easy to do. So hopefully you guys found this useful, and I'll see you in the next project. Hey guys, welcome to your next project. So I actually really like this project. I think it's really cool looking. So basically we just have a simple article. This could be anything at all, any website, any blog, whatever. And up here we have the little navigation icon. And if I click this, what's going to happen is it actually rotates the entire website, the entire container here, and then it brings in the nav here, the navigation items from the side, and the icon also changes. So basically we have two icons, open and close. We're going to position them so that when we click it, this circle rotates and shows the close button. Obviously we need a little bit of JavaScript to be able to add and remove the specific class, which we're going to call show nav, and that will, you know, rotate and bring the menu in. So I think this looks really cool. So it's going to be mostly CSS that we're dealing with. We need to add specific styles for specific elements when the show nav class is present. The only JavaScript we really need is to add and remove the class when we click this button. Okay, so let's get started. All right, so we're going to get started here. I have my project starter open. I also have a link here to the Font Awesome CDN so that we can use some icons for the open and close buttons. So in the title here, I'm just going to say rotating navigation. And down here, let's get rid of this H1. We're going to have a container that wraps everything. And in here, we're going to have a circle dash container that's going to wrap the circle. So another class of circle. And this is basically the circle that's going to be up in the corner with the buttons. So in here, we're going to have a button with the ID of close. And I just want to use an icon from Font Awesome. So FAS and then FA-times will be the icon. And right under that, we'll have a button with the ID of open, and this is going to be the icon FAS and then FA-bars, which will give us like that, you know, that hamburger look. So if I save that, we're just going to see our two buttons here. Now we want to be still within the main container, but outside of the circle container. So right above the last div, we're going to have our content, and you could put absolutely anything here in this content div. We're just going to put an H1 and say amazing article, and in small tags we'll put the author, our good friend Florin Pop, and then paragraph, let's do lorem 100 just to throw some dummy text in there. Under the paragraph we'll have another H3, and we'll say my dog, and we're going to have a picture of a dog. I'm just going to paste this this image tag in here, and of course, like I said, you could put anything you want here. This is just an unsplash image of a dog. And then underneath that, we'll have a paragraph. We'll do lorem 75. And save, and we get a cute little dog on the screen. So underneath the container, so the container ends here, the last div, we're going to put our nav. So let's just create a HTML5 nav tag with a UL. And then an LI, and I'm going to use icons here as well, so we'll do FAS and FA-home, and then next to that icon we'll just say home, and let's copy that down twice. So this one is going to be about, I mean these would probably be links, but that's fine, you can add the links if you want. So FA, let's do user-alt, and then for this is going to be contact. These aren't going to be actual pages. The point of this project is the actual animation and the position of the nav and all that, not the actual inner pages. So this will use envelope. Okay, so that should do it for the HTML. Let's jump into our style sheet, and we'll do a good part of this now. We might probably have to break it into another video because there's quite a bit of CSS. But I'm going to use the Lato font, so CSS * family equals Lato, and then we'll add that to our body, Lato. All right, and then let's see, we're actually not going to use all this flex stuff here, so I'm going to get rid of pretty much all of this except for let's see, except for the overflow hidden, which I'm actually going to change to overflow X hidden. So what that does is it only hides the scroll bar on the X axis, so going this way. So we want to be able to scroll this way. And then margin 0, and then let's also add a background color of 333, which is a dark gray, and then let's have color 222. And I know that that doesn't look right, but we're going to set the container background color to a light color. So let's do background color, and we'll do FA 3 times. Now with this container, basically it's going to rotate a little bit over when it has a specific class of show nav. So before I add anything else to the container, let's do container when it has show nav. And we can rotate it with the transform property, and then rotate, and I'm going to rotate it -20 degrees. All right, and then let's see, if we go back here and we just add that class manually to this show nav, then you can see it rotates. And I'm just going to keep that there for a second. We're going to want to change the transform origin. So transform origin, when you rotate, the origin by default is going to be like in the middle. It just turns it, it rotates it. However, we want it to rotate from the top left position. So it rotates, I can't really explain it. If you go to the MDN docs for transform origin, you'll be able to see how it works with different values. But we want to set the transform origin property to the top left. Okay, so now you can see the rotation point is up here instead of in the middle. Now we do want to transition on that because we don't want it to just flick, rotate real quick. We want it to be smooth. So let's add a transition onto that. We want to transition the transform property, say 0.5 seconds, and we'll just use linear. So it's just all one speed or whatever. And you can see it actually does it when I save, because we have that class on it. Now I'm going to just go ahead and get rid of that class for now, but we know that it does rotate when it has that specific class added. So some other things I want to do here is just set the width to 100 viewport widths. So basically take up the whole, the whole viewport horizontally, and then let's set the min height to, I'm going to set that to 100 viewport heights. So we want to take up the whole viewport. And then for padding, let's say padding 50 pixels all the way around. And that should do it for the container. Now let's work on the circle container, which is around this. So circle dash container, and I want to position this in a fixed position, and we want it to be like a half circle on the edge of the page. So we'll set this to -100 pixels for the top, and then left, same thing, -100 pixels. And right now we just don't see anything. Basically the buttons are not showing right now. So for the circle itself, because remember we have a circle container, but then we also have a class of circle that wraps around the icon. So this is where we're going to add like the background color. which is going to be hexadecimal FF7979. And let's set a height of 200 pixels and a width of 200 pixels. And now you can see it up in the corner there. We want this to be a circle, so border dash radius, we're going to set that to 50%, make that a half circle. Well, I mean, it's a full circle, but half of it's off the screen. That's what we did, -100, because we have 200 for the height and the width. If you increase or decrease this, you want to adjust that as well. And we want to position this relative, so we can position the buttons inside absolute. And this is going to rotate, so I want to add a transition on the transform property, and let's make that same thing, 0.5 seconds linear, so same as the container rotation. All right, and then for the buttons, let's say circle button. And for these, I know we can't see them at the moment. Let's actually position them first. So we'll position them absolute. Oops. So we want to position absolute, and let's put them top 50% and from the left 50%. And then let's make the height 100 pixels. And then let's set, and I know it doesn't look right yet, let's set the background to transparent. And they're both they're both in the same exact spot right now. We want to take off that border, so border 0. Let's set the font size bigger as well. So font size, we'll set that to 26 pixels. And let's set the color to white. Okay, and then I just want to get rid of this border when it's in its focus state. So let's say dot circle, and the button we want to target focus and set outline to none. Okay, good. Let's see. So each one has an ID of open, one has an ID of close. So I want to target the open. So circle button with the ID of open, and I'm going to set that left value to 60%. Okay, the open button is what we're going to see initially, and that's where I want it positioned. So for the close, let's say circle, and we want the button that has the ID of close, and I'm going to set that to top, and let's set that to 60%, and this is relative to the circle. Okay, and we want to rotate this close button, so let's use transform rotate, and we're going to rotate at 90 DEG, so 90 degrees. And let's set this transform origin. Oops. Transform origin is going to be top left as well. So now I save it, and you can't see it. It's up here. In fact, if I take my container here, and let's just temporarily set this to 200 pixels, you can see exactly where it's positioned. So just put that back to -100, and we should just see the lines here. And it's going to stay fixed there no matter what. This image, though, let's just fix that real quick. We're going to do the rest of the CSS in the next video, but I just want to target the content image and set a max width of 100% of its container, because that's bugging me. But yeah, you could have absolutely any content you want here, and we can see the nav and stuff down here. But in the next video, we'll finish the CSS, and then we'll add the little bit of JavaScript to be able to click this and, you know, add the show nav class, and it will do its whole rotation effect. Let's actually add, though, onto the button. Let's add a cursor pointer like that. All right, so that's it. I'll see you in the next video. All right, so we need to finish up our CSS. We have to deal with the actual nav down here. But before we do that, I'm just going to add a couple more content styles. So for the content itself, let's do a max width of 1000 pixels, and we'll set margin. Let's do 50 pixels on the top and bottom, auto on the left and right. Keep it in the middle, so even if we stretch it out, you know, it's going to have a 1000 pixel width max. And then for the H1, say content H1, we're just going to take the margin away from that, so margin 0. And then for the small tag, for the author, let's set a color of 555, and let's set a font style of italic. And then for the paragraphs, so content paragraph, we're going to set color to 333, and let's increase the line height to 1.5. And we already have the image at 100% width. Good. So now we just need to really deal with the navigation, which is right now is down here. And what I want to do, since we're only going to see this when this actually rotates, when we click this, I'm going to add the show nav. So show dash nav. I'm going to manually add it for now. And then the actual navigation, we want that to be positioned over here, right? So let's do this above where we did the content stuff. And I'm just going to use the nav tag as a selector. And I want to position this to be fixed, because we want it fixed down to the bottom. So we'll say fixed and bring it from the bottom 40 pixels up, and from the left 0. So that puts it, you know, near where we're actually going to want it. And then I'm just going to set a high Z index here, so it's on top. Let's do a Z index of 100. And then for the UL, let's say nav unordered list. Oops, not class, just nav. So for that, let's do a margin, not a margin, let's do a list style type of none. So that will get rid of those bullet points. And then I'm going to set padding left to 30 pixels. And then we want to style the list items, so nav ul li. And I want them all uppercase, so let's do a text transform uppercase, and let's change the color to white, and let's set a margin of 40 pixels on the top and bottom, so we're really going to separate them from each other. And then let's bring it over here. We need to have it initially over here more to the left, because it's going to come in as this rotates, or right after it rotates. So to do that, we can use transform, and we want to translate on the x-axis. So translate x, we want to bring it left, so that would be negative. We'll do negative 100%. So if I save that, now you can see that it's, you know, it's way over here. We can still see it a little, but that's fine. It's just going to come in. But we want that to come in smoothly, so let's add a transition on that. So transition, the transform property, and we'll do a 0.4 second duration, and we'll use ease in here. And then let's see, for the, you know what, let's comment this out for a minute just so we can actually see this. I want I want some more space between the icons, so let's do nav ul lii, and I'm going to set the font size, let's do 20 pixels, and let's set margin right to 10 pixels. Oops. Okay, so it makes the icon a little bigger, also puts some space in between them. Now, we're going to want each one of these to stick out a little more, kind of going at an angle. So what we can do is take the nav, let's say nav ul li, and then the direct li after that. And let's add a margin left of 15 pixels. So if I save that, what happens is the LIs after the initial LI are going to stick out 15 pixels. Now I want this last one to stick out even more, so what I'll do is take this, copy it, and let's say LI plus LI plus LI. So basically anything after, you know, this one here, so the contact one I want to stick out double that, so 30 pixels. So now you can see that it's at an angle, kind of at the same angle as the pages here. So we have initially we have this negative 100% translate X. So if I uncomment that, it goes almost off the screen, but we're going to want these ones to initially start out more over as well to the left. So I'm going to copy that, and for this one here where we have our margin left 15, let's do negative 150%, and then for this one here, let's do negative 200%, because we need those to be over more. Now when we have the show nav applied, we want it to actually show the navigation. Everything we just did is the default when you first come to the page. When this class is actually there, which it is now because we manually added it, we want to see all the navigation stuff. So let's go, where do we want to do this? We'll go right above the nav here, and let's say, so the container div, when it has show dash nav, then we want to take the direct navigation LIs after that, and we want to bring them into view. So let's set transform translate X on all of those to 0, which is going to bring it to its, you know, its original place. And I want to add a little bit of a delay, so we'll say transition delay. Spell that right? Transition delay. I'm going to set that to 0.3 seconds so that it comes in, you know, a little bit after. Oops, I forgot my semicolon. So it comes in a little bit after the rotation. So now we're able to see it because we have that show nav. So if we take this off, then we just have, you know, just looks normal. And then if we have it, you can see it rotates and it shows the navigation. Now we want to have the functionality where we click this, then it adds that class, which is going to be pretty easy. So let's jump into our script here, and let's create a variable called open, and we'll use document dot get element by ID. We have an ID of open. We also have an ID of close. So close, and then we also want to grab the container. So const container get element by ID. Actually, no, that's a class. So let's do, I mean, you could add an ID, or you could just use query selector. And we want dot container. It's a class. All right, so let's take open, and let's add an event listener to that. So we want to listen for a click, and when that happens, we're going to run an arrow function, and then we just want to take the container, and from the class list, we want to add the class of show-nav. And then close is going to be similar, so I'm just going to copy that, and let's change this to close, and then let's do container class list remove. All right, so if I save that and I click, okay, so that happens. So let me just reload. So I click, and that rotates, these shoot in, but we can't see the close here. So to handle that, let's go back to our CSS, and we basically just want the circle, this to rotate when there's that show nav class. So I'll go right below the circle. So let's say circle and dot show nav. And then we're not actually I'm sorry, not circle, container. So when the container has show nav applied to it, then we want to style the circle. And what we want to do with the circle is rotate it. So let's say transform rotate, and we're going to rotate it -70 degrees. Okay, so now once it rotates, we can see the close button. Just because of where it's positioned, when the circle rotates, it just comes into view. All right, so that looks pretty good. So not too bad. I mean, we're just adding and removing a class, and we're setting certain styles on the circle and on the navigation, you know, when we have that class applied. So you could use this on with any website, any application. So that's it. Let's go on to the next video, next project. All right, welcome to your next project. So in this one, we're going to build a simple login form here with a wave effect on the labels. So if I go ahead and I click in here in the input, you can see the label will then wave up. Okay, so we have that cool little animation when we click in here and when we click out. So basically the way we're going to do this is wrap a span around each one of these using JavaScript and add a transition so that the label moves up when we focus on the input, but we're also going to add a dynamic transition delay so it gives it that wave effect. So each letter goes up at a different time. All right, so that's what we'll be doing. Let's go ahead and get into it. Okay, so let's get started on our form input wave project. I have my project starter open here. I'm just going to say form input wave. And then let's get rid of this H1, and we're just going to wrap a container around our form. So we'll have a container with an H1. We'll just say please log in. It's just a basic login form. And we'll have a form tag here. We don't need an action. And in here we're going to have a form-control, which will wrap around the input, which is going to be type text. I'm also going to add required, which will just give it some basic validation. And then the label is going to go underneath, and we don't really need a for, so we'll get rid of that and say email. And then I'm going to go ahead and copy that down, and this one is going to be password. So type password and label password. Underneath that form control, we're going to have a button, and I'm going to give it a class of btn, and let's just say login. And then we'll have a div with the class of text. Actually, let's do we'll do a paragraph with a class of text and say don't have an account. And if they don't have an account, then we'll just have a link. Doesn't have to go anywhere, and say register. All right, so that's our form. Pretty simple. Now, before I get into the CSS, I just want to kind of explain what we're going to be doing as far as, you know, how to do this. And we want to use JavaScript to basically wrap each letter in a span, and we're going to have a transition on that span to move it up. So, or a transform translate Y value to move it up with a transition to make it smooth. And in JavaScript, when we wrap the span around each letter, we're also going to add a transition delay to each one that increases every letter, so that, you know, the first one goes up, and then the M would be delayed, then it would go up, A would be even more delayed, then it would go up. So it gives it that wave effect. So that's ultimately what we're going to end up with. In fact, I'll go ahead and just paste in what these labels will look like afterwards. So basically we'll have, you know, the label tag. You don't have to put this in. I'm just showing you as an example. We'll have each letter wrapped in a span with a transition delay that increments. So I'm just going to comment that out, but just so you can see what we're going to end up with. But before we get into any of that, let's just do some basic styling on this form because it looks horrible. So I'm going to use the Mully font. So we'll do family equals MULI, and then let's set that on the body. And then I'm going to set a background color for the body to steel blue, and the color of the text to white. That, and then let's style, let's see, we'll do the container, and let's add a background color of RGBA. I want it to have just kind of a transparent look, so black, and then 0.4 for for the alpha value. And let's add padding. So padding, we're going to do 20 pixels top and bottom, 40 left and right. And let's add a slight border radius of 5 pixels. All right, and then let's do container h1. So for that, I want to text align to the center. I also want to add a margin on the bottom of 30 pixels. Okay, and then the link, let's say container A, which is just a register link. I want to text decoration none. Take away the underline, and the color will be, let's set the color to light blue. So now we want to get into the form fields. First we have the form control, which wraps around the input and the label. So let's say form control, and I'm going to position that relative because I want the label to be positioned absolute within it. And then for margin, let's do 20 top and bottom, 0 left and right, 40 bottom. And I'm going to just set a width of 300 pixels. All right, and then let's do the inputs. So form control input. I'm going to set the background color to transparent and then get rid of that border. But I do want a border on the bottom. Oops. So let's say border dash bottom, and I'm going to set that to 2 pixels. Let's do white and solid. Okay, now I want it on its own line, so instead of inline, we want to display block. I also want it to go all the way across, so we'll set width to 100%. And we'll add some padding. Let's do 15 pixels on the top and bottom. And the font size for the input, I'm going to set to 18 pixels. And I think we should be good there. Let's set the color to white. And then the border here, or the outline I should say, we want to get rid of that. Also, if I submit and it's invalid, you get that border as well. So let's target form control input, and when it's in its focus, also we want form control input valid. And we're going to just set the outline on that to 0. Okay, so now we don't have that ugly border. Now, before we do it, I think we're going to do the label stuff in the next video, but let's finish like the button and the text down here. So we have a class of, actually we'll put this up, we'll do all the form stuff down at the bottom. So let's do btn, and I'm just going to set the cursor to a pointer. I'm going to display as an inline block for our button here, and I want it to go all the way across, so we'll say width 100%, and let's set the background of the button to light blue, and let's set the padding, we'll do padding 15 pixels, and let's, for font family, we're going to inherit, and then for font size, let's set that to 16 pixels. And the border, we want to get rid of that, so border 0, and I'm going to make the border radius the same as the container, 5 pixels. And I think that's all we want to do. Let's say btn focus, set that outline. Actually, we can add that down here. No, because we're going to add something else there. Yeah, let's just do outline 0 on btn focus. And we can have a little hover effect too. So, I mean, not hover, click effect or hover, whatever you want. So we're going to do button, and when it's active, so when we click down on it, we're going to add a transform and just scale it down a bit. So scale it from 1 to 0.98. So we get that little effect. All right. Yeah, so I think, what else? The text here, we can move that down a little bit. So under the button stuff, we have a class of text. And I'm just going to set the margin top to 30 pixels. Push that down a bit. Now, the label, don't worry about that. We're gonna style that next. And like I said, we need to use JavaScript to turn the label into letters with spans around them with a transition delay. We're also going to add a transition, obviously, on the label span. So we'll get into that in the next video. Okay, so we're going to finish this form up. So I'm going to work on the labels here. So down here, we'll just take form control labels, and we want to position those to be absolute and absolute, and that's because the form control itself is relative, so we're positioning it absolute within that. And we're going to put from the top 15 pixels and from the left 0. Now right now the way it is, if I start to type in here, it's going to just cover the label, but ultimately the label is going to wave upwards when we click in here. All right, now before we actually style the span, I want to add it, because right now there is no span. You know, we don't have this, it's just label and then the word. So we're going to use JavaScript to basically turn this into this. So let's jump into our script.js, and first thing we want to do is bring in our labels. So let's use document.querySelectorAll, because it doesn't matter how many labels there are, we want to get them all. So form-control label, and that'll give us a node list of all the labels. So since it's a node list, we can go ahead and use for each on it, and we'll say for each label, for each label, I'm going to take the label.inner HTML and set it. Now, first, there's a couple things we want to do. We want to get the inner text, inner text, which is just going to be, you know, each letter. So E-M-A-I-L in this case for the first one. And then I'm going to split it into an array. I'm going to go into the next line and call .split. And what that does, if we put an empty string in here, is it splits the letters into an array. So it'll be an array with the first value will be E, the second will be M, and so on. Now from that, I want to manipulate it, so I'm going to use .map, which you can use on an array, which now this is, to turn it into an array of something else. And what we want to turn it into for now is an array of the letters with a span around it with a transition delay. So let's say map, and this just takes in an arrow function. And we're just going to use backticks here because we want to just turn it directly into an array of spans that we're going to have here, but we need to pass in here for each letter. And then I also want the index, which just starts at 0 and increments for every item in the array. And I want to turn it into, let's say, span, and inside here we want to have whatever the letter is. So this will turn it into an array of letters with a span around it. Now obviously we don't want an array, we want it to be a string, so we can use join and just pass in an empty string, and that will turn it back into a string. Okay, so basically we have the inner text, so we're looping through the label, we have the inner text E-M-A-I-L for the first one. We're splitting it into an array, which will put each letter in its own item in the array. Then we're mapping it to create an array of the letter with a span around it, then we're turning it back into a string. So if I save this now, we don't see any difference here, but if I open up my Elements tab and I click on the label here, you'll see that now they're wrapped in spans. So I'm not going to add the transition delay just yet. Let's go back to our CSS, and now that we have these spans, we can add styling for it. So let's see, let's do just the span in general first. So we'll say form control label span, and I'm going to display, let's do display inline block. It's inline by default. And then I'm going to increase the font size to 18 pixels, because before this wouldn't have worked because we didn't have spans around them. And then let's do a min dash width of 5 pixels, and we're going to add a transition on this, because when we add the transform value, actually we'll add that first. So let's go up here, or down here rather, and let's say form control, input focus. So focus meaning, you know, when we click inside, we want the direct label span, and we also want to do this on the validation. So I'll actually just copy this down, and we also want the valid state. So input valid. And what we'll do is just first of all change the color to light blue. So if I click in here, you can see the label turns light blue. I also want to turn the border light blue as well. So up here where we did the outline on the input focus and valid, let's do bottom, or I'm sorry, bottom, border bottom, and let's set that, or border bottom color rather, and set that to light blue. So that way when we click in here, both the border and the text here is light blue. Now let's see, we want to move this up basically when we click in here. So to do that, we can add a transform, and we want to use translate Y because we're translating it, we're dealing with it on the Y axis. So translate Y, and I want to move it up, so it has to be a negative number. If I want to move it down, it would be positive. So let's do negative 30 pixels. So when I click in here, you can see they move up, and they just flicker up. It's not smooth, so that's why I'm going to add a transition onto the span right here. So let's say transition, and we'll do 0.3 seconds. And then we could do like an ease in, ease out. I'm going to use a cubic Bezier. So cubic Bezier. And then for the values here, basically what this is it defines a cubic Bezier defines a curve, and we can use it as a transition effect with a variable speed from start to end. And it takes in 4 points, which are P0, P1, P2, P3. P0 and P3 are the start and the end of the curve. So I mean, it can get a lot more complicated if you're doing like really cool animations, but this is pretty simple. We're just going to do a couple values here: 0.68, negative 0.55, 0.265, and 1.55. So we'll have a variable speed on this transition. So if I click in here, you can see now it doesn't just flick up, it has that cool, almost like a bounce effect. Now we don't want the whole thing to go up at once. You could do that. I mean, you could leave it like that if you want, but I want to have that wave effect, so that's where the transition delay comes in. Because we already have the transition, and it's transitioning the this right here, the transform translate, where it moves up. So in our script here, let's add onto the span an inline style, and we'll set that to, let's say, transition dash delay. Now when we set this, we don't want to set it to a fixed value because it'll do the same thing. It'll just wait and it'll flicker them all up at the same time. So what I'm going to do here is use the index, which just starts at 0, then 1, 2, 3, and so on, and I'm going to multiply it by 50. So the first one will be 0, second one 50, third one will be 150, then 200, 250, and so on. So now I'll save that, and if I click, okay, that didn't work. Oh, we need to add the milliseconds. So after the transition delay number, we need to have ms. All right, and there we go. And of course, you could change this. Like we could do 30. We could do 300, which is going to be very slow. So 300 milliseconds. I think that 50 is good though. You can make it faster, like 10, but you can barely see the wave. So I think 50 is a good number. So we'll keep it at 50 ms. All right, so that's how you can add this cool little effect. So that's it. Hopefully you guys like this project, and we'll move on to the next one. All right, so now we're going to create this 3D boxes project, and we're going to be using some modern CSS to create this 3D effect where we have this angle here and here, and we connect the right and the bottom side, and it just gives us a 3D box look. And then we're going to be using a background image or a background GIF for each of these boxes, and it's all the same image. It's this minion image, and what we're going to do is extend the background size beyond the single box to make it as big as this container here. And then what we'll do is dynamically calculate the background position so we can move these around and basically form what looks like one big image, when really this is just a bunch of the same image. We're also going to add an event listener onto this button here, so when we click this whole area shrinks, and it also gives us this rotate effect on each box, and then it combines them all together so there's no spacing in between, and it just looks like one big connected image. Alright, so we'll be using things like CSS transforms and transitions. We'll use the after and before pseudo selectors. We're going to be using a loop in JavaScript to go through these boxes and calculate the background position, and also add an event listener onto this with some CSS transitions to give it that rotation effect. Alright, so that's what we'll be doing. Let's go ahead and get started. Alright guys, so we're going to get started on the 3D boxes background project. So I have my project starter open, my 3 files here. Now the HTML for this is going to be really simple. It's actually only going to have 2 lines in the body. One will be the button and one will be the box's container. And then the individual 16 boxes that are going to transform into one box when we click the button, those are going to be created from within the JavaScript. However, for now, until we get to that, I will just hard code them, and then we'll remove them later on and add our JavaScript. Alright, so let's go ahead and get started here. Let's just change the title to, say, 3D boxes background, and let's get rid of this H1, and let's put our button. So we have a button, and I'm going to give it an ID of BTN and a class of magic, and inside here we'll say magic, and I'm just going to paste in an emoji here. You don't have to, but if you want that, you can just grab it from the repository. And then we're going to have our boxes container. This is going to have an ID of boxes because we do need to use it within the JavaScript, and for styling we'll add a class of boxes. And inside here, like I said, this is ultimately going to come from the JavaScript, but for now we're just going to hard code them. So let's go ahead and say a class of box, and we want 16, so we're going to do asterisk 16, enter, and that will give us 16 divs with the class of box. Go ahead and save that, and all we're going to see is the button, because obviously these are just empty divs, but we have to go ahead and style these. So let's jump into our style CSS, and we have our boilerplate, our Roboto font. We are going to use the Poppins font for the button, so what I'll do is just go ahead and duplicate this, and let's go right here, right before the ampersand, get rid of this, and let's put in Poppins, like that. And then down here in the body, we're just going to add a background color of a very light gray, so it's going to be FA 3 times. Can't really even see the difference, but just a light gray background. And then let's start on the styling for the button, which has a class of magic. So let's say magic, and we're going to give this a background color of a yellow. So we'll use hexadecimal here with the value of F9CA24. Okay, so that'll be the background. The color is going to be white. Let's add our font family here of Poppins sans serif. Save that. Good. We want to get rid of that ugly border, and let's give it some rounded corners. So border radius I'm going to do 3 pixels, and let's make the font size 16 pixels. We'll add some padding to make this bigger. We'll do 12 on the top and bottom, 20 on the left and right. Good. We want to have a cursor pointer so that when we hover over it, we have our pointer. Let's position this to the top. So I'm going to use position fixed, which will position it fixed in the browser window, and we'll say from the top 20 pixels. Okay, so that'll move it up. And then let's also add some letter spacing to space out the letters a little. We'll do 1 pixel for that. Good. And let's see, we're also going to add a little box shadow on the bottom. So for box shadow, we have our X offset, which I'm going to set to 0, and then the Y offset, I'm going to set that to 3 pixels because I just want it to be slightly on down here on the Y axis, right on the bottom. And then for the color, we'll use an RGBA yellow, so red, green, blue, alpha. So 249 for red, 202 for green, 36 for blue, and then for the alpha, which is the transparency, we'll do 0.5. So now you can see that there's a slight box shadow underneath. All right, now I want to get rid of this ugly outline on the focus state. So what we can do is take the magic class and say on the focus state we want to set the outline property to none. Get rid of that, and then I also want an effect that when we click, or we click and hold when it's in its active state, that it moves down a little bit and gets rid of the box shadow, so it gives the effect of it's going over the box shadow. So how we can do that is with magic in the active state, we want to first remove the box shadow, so we'll set box shadow to none, and then we'll go ahead and set the transform property, and we're going to use translate Y because we want to translate, we want to move it along the Y axis just 2 pixels, which will move it down. If I did negative 2 pixels, it would move it up. So let's save that, and now you can see when I click and hold, it basically like covers that box shadow. Alright, so I'm also going to add to this magic button a Z-index of, we'll just put 100 because I want it to always be on top, even if the browser is really short and the image, the boxes go underneath, I want the button to be on top. Alright, so that takes care of that. Now we're going to start on the boxes. So we have the boxes container, and then we have the individual box class, right? Now I want to be able to see what we're doing with the boxes, so for now I'm just going to add a background of yellow, and the height and the width here are very important, so that it's going to be 125 for both. Okay, so the width is going to be 125. Now the reason for that is because the boxes, the container, is going to have, let's do a height, is going to have a height and a width of 500, which is 125 times 4 is 500, and we want 4 across. Now to create the rows and columns with our CSS, we'll go ahead and use flexbox on the container. So let's say display flex. Okay, as soon as I do that, they all get put in a row. However, they're not being knocked down to the next. I mean, there's only 4 that can fit here, so I want them to wrap. Basically, if it hits the edge, I want them to go on to the next line, create a new row, so we can say flex wrap and set that to wrap. Okay, now the reason it looks like one big block is because the numbers here are exact, right? 125 times 4 is 500, so there's no in between here. Now, ultimately what I want to do is click this button and have them separate, have each box separate. So what I'll do is I'll add a class onto this called big. Okay, and I'm going to save that, and then I'm going to say down here, if the boxes class also has a big class, then let's go ahead and extend the width and the height to 600 pixels. Okay, so from 500 to 600. And that's going to make the container bigger. Now, this obviously doesn't look right. We want this remaining space over here to be around each element, around each box. So what we can do is where we display flex here, we can set the justify content to be space around. Now if I save that, you can see now the remaining space is around each element. Alright, we're also just going to add a position. Let's add position relative to boxes, and then down here for each box, let's go ahead and replace the yellow with an image, with that GIF. Okay, so we're going to say background image, and we want to set that to URL, and the link I'm just going to paste in. This is from giphy.com, and if you want to use a different GIF from this website or something else, you can do that. So I'm going to go ahead and save that, and now you can see that we just have this one image in every box as the background. All right, now ultimately we're going to want to change the positioning and the size of each of these. So let's actually add a background repeat, and we'll set that to no repeat. And then for the size, background size, we want to set this to the same size as the initial boxes, because we want it to take up that entire thing. Right now we have the class of big on, so it's at 600, but ultimately we want the size to be 500 pixels on X and Y. Okay, so now you can see that it's stretched out and you can only see part of the image, and it's the same part in each box, but later on we're going to change the positioning of each of these so that it looks like one big image. All right, so let's see, the next thing that we'll do here, we want to have a position of relative on this, because we're going to be using the before and after pseudo selector to give that cubed border look, and we need to position that absolute, so we want the container of that to be relative. Now another thing we want to do is when we do click this button, what's going to happen is it's going to toggle this big class. Okay, so it's going to go from that to that, and when that happens I want to have a rotate effect, so we want to add a rotation to the boxes if it has the big class. So let's go right here and let's say, so if boxes has the big class, we want each individual box to have a transform, and we're going to use rotate Z with a 360-degree angle. Okay, now we want this, when this happens, we want it to transition nicely, so let's add a transition onto boxes. So transition, just so it rotates smoothly, and we'll use 0.4 seconds with an ease effect, and then I'm just going to copy this and put the transition in the box as well. And now as soon as I save, you can see that it actually does that effect. Okay, because when that big class gets added, it will go ahead and do that, and we're going to make this button ultimately add and remove that class, which will make it twirl into place. Okay, so it'll twirl, or I should say rotate, and then go all together, and then it'll rotate and split apart. All right, hopefully that makes sense. Now the last thing that I want to do here is add that cubed effect. So not only do we want like a border on the right and the left, but we want it to skew so it goes like this at an angle. So to do this, to do the right side, we're going to use the after pseudo selector. So we can take the box class and then say : after, and you can use this to insert content. It needs this content value, and we could even put something in here, and now you can see that after that box element it puts hello, but we don't want that. We just want to leave this blank. The only reason we need this is to add some styling, so you can think of it as kind of like an invisible element. So this, for the styling, let's go ahead and add a background color, and we're going to use the background color of F6E 58D. It's going to be the background. We're not going to see anything just yet. We need to add the sizing and position and stuff like that. So we want to position this absolute. Okay, so we're positioning it absolute, and you need to have relative on the box because absolute should be, it's relative to the box, right? And then for the positioning, the coordinates, we'll do 8 pixels from the top. We want to, because we want to push it down a little bit because we're going to add that skew. And then over, let's do from the right, let's do -15 pixels because we want it to be, going this way. And then for the height, we want it to take up 100% of its container, which in this case is the box itself, and then the width is going to be 15 pixels. So if I save that, you can see we have this yellow part here, and it's pushed down a little bit because of this 8. In fact, if I put a 0 here, you can see it's flush. However, I want to use that, I want to have that skew effect here and here, so it'll be on both sides. And to do that, we can just use transform, and we want to skew on the y-axis because it's up and down, it's vertical, so skew y 45 degrees. And if I save that, now you can see we have that effect of it's coming off here and going, you know, at a skewed angle on both the top and bottom. Now we want to do the same thing here. We basically want it to come from here and go over, so it looks like it has that 3D effect. So I'm actually going to just copy this whole thing, and now we're going to use before. Okay, and for the background color, we're going to change it slightly. We're going to use the same yellow. Whoops. We're going to use the same yellow that we used. Where is it? Where's the yellow that I used for the button? Right here. So we're going to we'll just copy this background color here and set that here. Okay, just slightly different yellow. And for the positioning, we want it to be absolute, although we want to change. We're going to go, let's see, from the bottom, we want to go -15. And then from the left, we want to go 8 pixels. Okay, so it's basically the reverse of what we had before. And then the height, the width is going to be 100%, and then the height will be 15. So it's basically just the horizontal version of what we just did. And then we want to skew on the x-axis because it's horizontal. So I'll save that, and now you can see we basically have that same thing but going this way. So what we want to do in the next video is, of course, we want to add the functionality where we click this button and it does its little rotate and goes into what looks like one big image, and we want to be able to toggle that. But we also need to change the background position. We need to make that dynamic within these boxes, because right now they're just all in the same position, which obviously doesn't look right. We want it to look like it's one big image. All right, so that's what we're going to get into next. Okay guys, so now we want to start on the JavaScript, which isn't a lot actually. It's only about 20 lines or so, a little less. But I first want to just explain what we need to do with the background position. So ultimately, as I said before, all of these boxes are going to be inserted to the DOM via JavaScript. We're not going to have these hard-coded. And we're also going to add a background position to each one. Now I'm going to do that manually just so you can see what the values are going to be. So for this first one, we'll just go ahead and set a style here and set the background position. So background position has an X and Y property. For this first box, it's going to be 0, 0. Okay, which is the default, so I mean it's not even going to change, but that's going to be the first one. The next one, let me just copy this right here, this whole style, and put that in. So this one here, let's think about where this needs to be. So remember, these are 125 pixels width and height. So for this one, we want part of the 125 pixels to be shifted this way. All right, so with this background position, this first value is the X value. So we want to go -125 pixels. And if I save that now, you can see that it basically looks like it's connected. In fact, if we get rid of this big class and we save, it is connected. So for the next one, and if you guys want to take a second and think about what you should put here, go ahead and do that. So we did, for the X value for the second box, we said -125. Now for this one here, we want to actually double that, right? So instead of -125, because if I do that, it's going to just match this one. We want to go over 125 more, so we want to change this to 250. Okay, and now it looks like it's part of the image, like it's one big image. For this one here, the fourth one, let's go ahead and do -375. And there we go. So now we have our top row. Now for this one here, it's going to be a bit different because now we're dealing with both X and Y values. So for this one, we're going to have, and I'm going to get rid of this. I'm just showing you what what we need to do within the JavaScript. But this is going to be 0 on the X-axis because it's the first one, and it's going to be on the Y-axis. We want to do -125 because we want to bring it up. Okay, now the second one we need to bring over and up, or I should say that it's actually the sixth one. We need to bring over and up. So what we would do is on the x-axis 125, and then on the y negative 125. There we go. Okay, and then we would just continue that, bringing these up and over. So what I'll do is just completely get rid of all the boxes. Okay, we just want to have the container here. We just want to have this ID boxes, class boxes, and then that's going to completely go away. Now we're going to jump into our script and do this with JavaScript. So first thing we need to do is bring in any elements that we need, such as the boxes container. So we'll use the document object, and we're going to use the method getElementById, and we're going to get the ID by the box's ID. And then we also want the button, because we need to add an event listener to that. So let's say const btn, and we'll use document getElementById. I believe it has an ID of btn. Okay, so we bring those in. Now the way that I'm going to do this is we're going to have a function called createBoxes, and we want to call that function. And then inside createBoxes, we need to create 4 boxes for each row, so 4 columns of, or 4 rows, 4 columns. So the way we can do that is we can use 2 for loops. Okay, so let's say 4, and I'm not going to explain what a for loop is. It is expected that you know at least the fundamentals before taking this course. So let's say let I, so we want to set I to 0, and then the condition here is going to be if I is less than 4, and then we want to increment I by 1. Okay, now we have rows and columns here, so we want to put another for loop, and we have to use something different than I. So let's do let j equals 0, and then as long as j is less than 4, and then j plus plus, increment it by 1. Now within here we want to construct those 16 boxes. Okay, so this is going to loop through 16 times, and we're going to create this with document, and then there's a method called createElement, and we want to create a div. Remember, so we're just creating these divs here. That's all we're doing right now. And we can even go ahead and console log box, and if we go over here and open our console, you see that we now have, should be 16 divs. Now remember, they need to have the class of box, so what we can do is take our box variable, our box element, take the class list and call the add method, and we want to add the class of box. So if we save that, now we can see that over here in the console. Now this is where we're going to do the positioning. So to add a specific CSS style, we can use .style and then whatever property we want, and it has to be in camel case, obviously. So we want background position, and we can't do background dash position, which is what we would do in CSS. We do it like this with camel case. So background position, and the way we can set this to be dynamic is we can put some template literals here, so that we can use variables and expressions, and remember, it's going to be something like, you know, negative 125 pixels 0. It's going to be something like this, but of course this is going to be dynamic. So what we can do is we can put a variable syntax, so $ and curly braces. We can put a variable or an expression in here, and we're going to take negative j, because remember it's going to be negative negative 125, negative 250, etc. So we want to take that and multiply it by 125. So it'll loop through. It'll be, you know, 0, then negative 125, negative 250, negative 375. So that's the x value. Now for the y, we're going to go ahead and put another variable expression in here and use negative I, and also multiply by 125. So this will do exactly what I did manually a few minutes ago, but it will add it, you know, through the JavaScript dynamically with these calculations. Now the last thing we want to do is not console log. Let's get rid of that. We want to take our boxes container that we brought in earlier, and we want to call append child, and we want to add in the box. So if I go ahead and save, let's see, something's not right here. Let's see, so we set the box.style background position to, oh, I forgot pixels. So right now it's just setting it to the numbers. We need to actually add in px after these pixels, and there we go. So right now we have the class, I'm sorry, we don't have the class of big, so it's 500 pixels, which squishes them all together, and there's no in between. But if I add the class of big, it separates them, but it's still intact. Now we just want to add an event listener onto, let's actually get rid of, no, we'll keep the class there to start with, but let's go back to our script and let's go up here. Actually, we'll go, we'll do it right here. So we'll take our button and we want to add an event listener. So we want to listen for a specific event. Now this takes in the event we want, which is a click, and then a function. So we can either put, function, or we can use an arrow function like this. Okay, and we just want to, we don't even need, since this is only going to be one line of code, we don't even need these curly braces. So we'll just take the boxes container and take class list and then toggle, so it'll add and remove the class of big. So let's save that. Let's go over here. Let's click, and there we go. So we get that cool effect. And just to show you, let me just make this bigger because we're just about done. If I show you in the console, let's put this over here, and if we look at this class, right, so you can see that the class of big is there. If I click that, it adds and removes it, and that's what causes that effect. And we have that rotate in the CSS, right? So right here we have this rotate, which is causing that to happen. We also have a transition of 0.4 seconds. You can increase that if you want, or decrease that if you want a different speed. But yeah, so that's pretty much it. All right, so hopefully you enjoyed this little project, and let's move on to the next one. All right, guys, in this project we're going to create a hoverboard. So it's just kind of a cool little effect. We're going to paint these boxes onto the screen. We're going to style them with CSS, and we're going to basically set a certain number. So right now it's set to 500 in the JavaScript, and it's going to paint that number of boxes. And then we're going to have event listeners for mouse over and mouse out, so that when we hover over, it's going to give us a random color. Okay, so you can see if I hover over that, it's blue, then it's purple. So we'll have an array of colors that we'll basically have to choose from for each box when we hover over it. So it gives us this cool effect. And this could be used for some kind of drawing application or something like that. We'll be using CSS transitions, so we have that cool fade out effect as well. All right, so let's go ahead and get started. Okay, let's go ahead and start on this hoverboard project. So in the HTML here, let's change the title up to hoverboard. And all we're going to have in this HTML is a class of container, because in this container we're going to have a bunch of divs with the class of square, like this. In fact, what I'll do is just, I'll put some in here now, but later on we're going to get rid of these because they're going to get inserted via JavaScript. And we're going to set a certain amount of squares to be painted onto the screen. So for now, we'll just throw these in. And let's jump into our style sheet. And let's see, for the body here, let's set a background. And I'm going to set that to 111. So, I mean, font doesn't really matter. We're not having any fonts here. If you want to add some text or something, you can, but I'm just going to get rid of all that. We don't need it. Okay, and then let's do display flex, and we don't need column. Just to put everything in the middle, we're going to keep this. And then we have the container, which actually I gave it a class. Let's give it an ID as well. So ID container, because I'm going to use that for the JavaScript. And then here, let's say class container, and we want to display flex. Actually, before we do the container, let's do the squares. So I'm just going to comment that out for a second. And then let's add our square class and set a background color. And background color, I'm going to set this to hexadecimal 1D 3 times. So let's see, we can't see anything just yet. Let's add a box shadow of 0, 0 for the offsets, 2 pixel blur, and black. Okay, and then for us to be able to see these squares, we have to add a height and a width. So let's give these a height and a width of 16 pixels. So we'll do height, width of 16. Good. So now we can at least see the squares. I'm going to just add a margin of 2 pixels as well. Just pull them apart a little bit. And we're going to want to transition. So ultimately, we're going to paint these on the screen, and then we're going to make it so that when we enter, it turns a certain color, a random color, and when we leave it, it gets rid of that color. And we want that to happen at kind of with a little fade effect. So I'm going to add a transition here for, let's say, 2 seconds ease. And let's also set for the square hover. So when we hover over it, I'm going to set the transition duration to 0 seconds so that we have an effect where when we hover over it, it immediately lights up, and then when we come off of it, it will basically take 2 seconds for the color to disappear, so it'll have that fade effect. Okay, we're not going to see that just yet, but we'll get to that. So the container, let's see, we want to display flex. As soon as I do that, it's going to display in a row. And I just want to set align items to center and justify content to center. And I want these to wrap, so we'll set flex wrap to wrap. We're not going to see a difference now because we don't have that many boxes. But we want to give this a max width of 400 pixels. Okay, so if it goes beyond that, then it should wrap onto the next line. So just to test that out, let's take these and let's create a bunch of them and save. And now you can see when it gets past that 400 pixels or whatever, it will wrap onto the next line. Okay, so that looks good. I think that's all we need to do for the CSS. So let's clear out all of these squares, because like I said, we're going to paint them with the JavaScript depending on, you know, what we set for the amount of squares. And that's all we need is just this one container. So in the next video, we'll jump into our JavaScript and we'll get started on that. Alright, so now we have the fun part, which is the JavaScript. So let's jump into script.js, and first thing we want to do is grab the container, which is the only element that we have in the body. So let's say document.get element by ID, and that has an ID of container. Now we want to create an array of colors here because we want these to be random colors when we follow along the squares. So I'm going to just paste in some hexadecimal values. You can use absolutely any colors you want. They can be hexadecimal, they can be RGB, they can be color names, whatever you want. And then we want a variable here. I'm going to give this just all caps here, call this squares, and then the amount of squares that we want to put on the screen, which is going to be 500 in this case. I don't know why I put a semicolon. I don't use semicolons. So those are the variables we need, and then the way we're going to do this is create a for loop. Okay, so we want to say for, and let's let I equal 0. Okay, so it's going to start at 0, and then as long as I is less than whatever we have in squares, and then we want to increment I by 1. So in here we're going to create an element. So let's say const square, and on the document object there's a method called, let's spell this right, document. There's a method called create element, and we can create any type of DOM element that we want. I'm going to create a div, and then I want to add the class of square. So I'm going to take the square element and I'm going to say class list dot add, and I want to add the class of square because that's, you know, the square we styled this square class, and that's what we want to show. Now this isn't going to do anything just yet. We want to take the container that we brought in and we want to append child because we want to insert this into the container, and we'll pass in here square like that. Okay, now if we save this, you can see that 500 squares have now been painted. If I change this to 200 and I save, now we have 200. So you can change this to whatever you want, but we're going to go ahead and paint 500 squares. And then what we want to happen is when we hover over these, we want to basically have them light up with a random color. So inside this for loop, let's take the square and I want to add an event listener. So I'm going to say add event listener and pass in the event. In this case is going to be mouse over. So when we just hover over a square, this is going to fire off, and I want this to call a function that we're going to create that says, that's called set color, and we want to pass in that particular square. All right, we want to do the same thing when we leave, so we'll have an event listener on mouse out, so when we leave a square, and then we'll call remove color. Okay, and then let's go down here and let's create function set color and say element, and just for now let's console log here element. So if I save that and I open up my console, let's see, remove color is not defined, so I just need to define remove color element. Alright, so now if I hover over a square, you can see it's just gonna, or I shouldn't say hover, but if I mouse over, it's gonna call that. Alright, if I come out of it, it's gonna call remove color. So if I just do like console log 1 2 3 and we go over here, you'll see that each time I get out of a square, it's gonna fire this off. Alright, so let's get rid of that and let's do the set color first. So we need to have a specific color. I'm going to have a function called get random color because we don't want it to always be the same one. So down here, let's say function get random color, and we want to return, and remember we have that colors array, and we can access, like the 0 index is going to give us this one, then 1 2 3 4. So I want to get a random index. So inside here, instead of hard coding a number, I'm going to say math.floor because I want to round down, and then math.random. So math.random gives me a random decimal. I want to multiply that by the length of the array. So colors.length. That way it's going to be somewhere in between 0 and what, 4. So 0 1 2 3 4. Okay, in fact, I can go ahead and console log here the color, and if I go over and hover, you'll see that it's going to be one of those colors. Good. So now we just need to set it to the actual square, in this case the element, because the square is getting passed in as the element. So we can set the style. Let's set the style dot background, and we're going to set that equal to whatever the color is. And then also the box shadow, let's set element, element dot style dot box shadow. You want to use camel case for this, and we're going to set that to, let's use some backticks here, and it's going to be 0 0 2 pixels, and then whatever the color is. So in here we'll pass in the color, and then another shadow, so a comma 0 0 10 pixels, and then whatever the color is. All right, so if I save that, let's close the console up and go over here, and you can see wherever I go, it's going to give me a random color. So you could create like a drawing app with this. You can make them smaller, and you could add some other functionality to it. I just want I just want them to disappear once we come off it, because right now we can fill the whole thing. I mean, if that's what you want to do, that's fine, but I want to remove the color. So what we'll do is when that remove is called, we'll take the element and set the style dot background, and we want to set it back to the original color of the box, which is this right here. Okay, so we're going to set that equal to that color on remove, and then set the box shadow. So element dot style dot box shadow, we're going to set that to the original box shadow, which is this right here. So pass that in here. All right, so let's save that, and now you can see I can go over and get a random color, but it disappears and it fades out like that. It takes 2 seconds to fade out because of this transition right here. Okay, so if I take this transition off, then it's just going to do this, and that is kind of stupid. So we want to leave that trail by doing that, adding that transition. And just like with any other project in this course, I encourage you to add to it. Maybe have a select box where you can choose different color schemes or something like that. I'm sure that you can think of something. This is just a good template to create some kind of drawing application or something like that. All right, so that's it. Let's move on to the next project.